Entrepreneurship was in decline for decades. Then the pandemic happened and something shifted. We'll talk about whether it will last today in conversations ahead of the Introduced by Technically conference. Hey, I'm Chris Wink in for your normal Culture Builder live conversation, but ahead of Technically's annual conference Introduced coming up May 12th, 2022. We are having conversations on topics of building better companies and the big systems and trends inside of it. One of those is business formation, entrepreneurship. This is something that we at Technically have held close to our hearts for almost 15 years of reporting, and someone who's done work for at least that long, if not longer, is my guest today. Victor Hwang is the CEO and founder of Right to Start, longtime networker and champion around ecosystem building around entrepreneurship. Victor, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Christopher. It's great to be here.
Yeah, same. And I'm glad to have this conversation. So let me start with the softballs. Most Americans work at large companies. Start with me off. Why do we care about entrepreneurship? Why is it something that you have started in the last 2 years, an organization focused on growing rates of entrepreneurship? Why is this an issue that's so important to you that you think we should be paying attention to?
Well, there's the kind of the hard number issues or the economic issues. So one, this is research that's come out within the last decade, which not a lot of people know, but almost all net job growth in an economy is actually from young businesses. So older businesses actually shed jobs over time. But if you want new jobs, they actually come on the whole in an economy from the young businesses. And so if you actually think about the job debate in the country, we actually tend to still think about, well, what are the big companies doing with jobs? But that's actually the wrong debate. If you actually look at the hard data, the real new jobs are actually coming from young businesses. On top of that, and this is also surprising for folks, and this is data that came out over the last decade as well, the rate of entrepreneurship within the country has actually been in decline over the last 4+ decades. So we're actually in a startup slump in America. People are really surprised when you say it because it doesn't feel like that when you look at the media. There's so much glorification and lionization of our entrepreneurs. But what's happened is that everyday entrepreneurs actually, there are fewer and fewer of them relative to the businesses in the whole economy. So that's actually been a struggle. So there's that macroeconomic point of view, which is entrepreneurs actually create new jobs and entrepreneurship has been in decline. And then there's that deeper issue, which I think goes to a lot of the sense in the economy that people feel powerless, or they feel like the system is too big and they've lost their way. And entrepreneurship is really about empowering people to tap their own potential, the skills that people are best at. It's unlikely that the skills that you're best at, for everybody, happens to be working within a fixed employer system. People should have the optionality, and if they don't have the option to leave an employer, then that's really not freedom. It's not really the ability to take your own economic life in your own hands. And so with Right to Start, this organization I started, we actually believe, we call it Right to Start because we believe that entrepreneurship is a basic human right. It's just like your right to speech and your right to worship. You have a right to start. You have a right to be entrepreneurial. That basic human condition of being able to take your potential and create your craft and build something out of it, whether it's creating your own business, launching an enterprise, or being a sole proprietor or a contractor. It's really up to you, but that right should be there, and the system should actually support it, not hinder it and suppress it.
A small clarification, because you worked on much of the research that you alluded to, including that really important work on clarifying new businesses are largely responsible for net new jobs. There's a lot of nuance there in the entrepreneurship reporting. And I've struggled as a business reporter with this. We know that there are times when productivity gains can come with scale. We typically talk about new businesses finding really important market niches and filling and creating efficiencies. We love small business. Of course we do. Politicians love it. We all do. We like them. And many of them are super inventive. But sometimes small businesses can operate in inefficiencies. That can be their charm. I wonder if you have, at Right to Start or in your work, do you have this idealized vision of how we want the mix to be? I imagine we do want some larger entities. They do tend to create real efficiencies. I imagine we want some proper small business that might not be particularly efficient, but give us a lot of cultural value. And I know we want a churn of new businesses, some of whom might end up bigger, some of whom might fail, some of whom might stay in a smaller channel. Do you have that idealized vision of what our business mix should look like, and how far we are from it?
Yeah, clearly you need large corporations. I mean, if you look around us, even our lives, most of the goods that are produced are from large corporations that can produce at scale. Most of those products and innovations, though, if you look at the source of it, a lot of that early technology comes from the startup businesses. And so the way to think of it is really like a giant funnel. That what that everything big started out small. Every great tree started out as a little sapling. Every big river started out as a little stream. And so somewhere you have to keep nurturing that front of the funnel. And that's what we mean when we talk about the importance of entrepreneurship, is feeding the front of the funnel of the broader economy. That's not to say you don't need large corporations. In fact, large corporations, you know this, they're suppliers, they're customers, they're investors, they're partners of small businesses everywhere, and they're essential. The key is the balance and keeping that dynamism within the funnel alive, so you're feeding more stuff into that funnel. I'll give you a great example of it. This just happened a few months ago. It's sort of a story not a lot of people know, but there's a company called Dot's Pretzels, started by a woman named Dot Henke in North Dakota, town of about 1,500 people. And a suburban mother started going to parties and didn't like the pretzels that people were having. And so she created her own pretzel seasoning. And she started sharing it around, and people loved it. And she made more and more of it. And she started to build a business around selling these pretzels. Fast forward, last year, half of all pretzel sales growth in America were attributed to Dot's Pretzels. And the company was acquired by Hershey's in December for $1.2 billion.
Mm.
And so this is the economy, right? You have people creating new products, ideas, enterprises, some of which grow, a lot of which don't. But that's the funnel by which we create things that end up getting sold and at scale across the whole system and make things better and better all the time.
Mm. So let's turn to what has shifted in the last 2 years. As you alluded to, we've been in a startup slump for decades. I joked with you earlier that I believe in March 2020, I penned a good golly, here comes another recession. We know what happens during recessions. If you know the numbers, is that we have a big giant startup slump. The startup slump gets worse. So brace yourselves, everybody. And then the numbers started coming out, and business information was spiking in for a while. We weren't sure if is this a big scam to get PPP money, but no, actually they seem like they're the high growth companies. I remember talking to economists and academics in those early days of 2020, trying to figure out what is this all happening. We at Technically are interviewing people who are forming companies and trying to find, is this lasting? Is this total buzz? It then continued into 2021. There are lots of reasons why we've had a startup slump that we won't even be able to get into. It's its own interview. There's conversations around regulatory and antitrust legislation. There's conversations around healthcare. There's 1,000 reasons that we think might go into our startup slump. And not all of those things have changed, but something clearly has changed. So talk to me a little bit about, from your vantage point, what happened to entrepreneurship during the pandemic, these last couple of years?
Well, the data clearly shows that there was in the beginning, there was a huge collapse of new businesses during the shutdown, when people really, when we saw the hockey stick of COVID, and we thought, my God, this is going to end, civilization. That shutdown lasted a few months. And then what we saw towards the back half of 2020 and throughout 2021 was the surge in entrepreneurial activity. And that caught folks by surprise. What's true is that entrepreneurs are the ones that often suffer the most during recessions, because they're the small guys and gals and they get hit the hardest. But they're also the ones that pull us out of recessions, because they adapt and they create and they build new things. And so what's happened is we saw people just adjust their lives. And this is not news, but the realization that you could start doing you could use these technological tools like Zoom, these types of interviews. I mean, this really shifted a lot of people's perceptions about what was possible, and people started creating new enterprises. It's hard. All of us know people that have created new enterprises out of the last couple of years. It's just, my wife has actually gone into business for herself. I mean, this is just,
cheers.
It's widespread. And so that's happening for real. What is interesting, though, is that these are really accelerating, I think, a lot of the deep-seated technological shifts that are already happening. Like Zoom was really just starting to pick up right before the pandemic. People were starting to do remote work right before the pandemic. I remember in the 1 to 2 years before the pandemic, there was all that debate around, is remote work really going to catch on? And how long will it take for remote work to feed through the Fortune 500 companies and the larger institutions? And so it was inevitable at some point. The pandemic just, put it on booster rockets and brought us into where we are now. So I think entrepreneurship, that happened. The real question, though, is what about the rest of the system? Has the system really adjusted to this? And what we've seen is that a lot of the basic governance and economic systems have actually stayed in place. And so, yeah, you may be able to, for instance, run a home business now that in a way that you couldn't before the pandemic. But in a lot of jurisdictions, including Washington, D.C., there are limits on what you can do with a home business. In Washington, there's actually, you can only have a home business no more than X percent or X number of square feet in your residence.
Mm.
So you think about how unequal that is. That's great for people that live in a 4-bedroom house in the suburbs. But what about people that live in a studio apartment that actually only have 1 bedroom? I mean, you've actually created an unjust system. And the law was not intended for that. The law was originally built, I'm sure, because they wanted to have zoning issues. They didn't want to turn residential areas into commercial markets and create industrial space where people were living. But we're in 2022. You can have people running home businesses that are actually cleaner and more efficient and don't really disturb the rest of the neighborhood. So we've got laws and systems that are from the 20th century trying to be retrofit onto a current 21st century virtual economy.
I want to turn here in a moment to your point there of what might help make this boom last. But to linger for a minute, you gave me, to be somewhat cliche, but in the late 80s, there's that famous line from economist Robert Solow that computers are showing up everywhere except for the productivity statistics. Because at that point in the 80s, there was this narrative of like, everyone's getting computers, it's going to change everything. And economists were very soberly looking at the numbers and saying, literally nothing has changed. And then the 90s came, and we actually did see this real dramatic shift. And in a lot of the literature, it comes up, it took longer than we really realized for people to adapt and actually really change behavior. It turns out you can give someone a new piece of technology, they don't necessarily use it in its optimal form right away. And I feel like maybe a decade of the work that you and many have done to set up entrepreneurship pipelines and offer tools and the explosion of YouTube videos and blog posts about how to do it well and so much work, Shark Tank on TV, like all of this kind of was bubbled up. And for years, I and other people were like interviewing and writing about, why isn't this having an impact? Why is there no entrepreneurship boom? It just keeps declining year in, year out. Nothing's really changing. And then maybe we had a moment where a couple of years ago we said entrepreneurship is showing up everywhere except for in the business formation statistics. And then we had a moment where actually everything was ready to light a fire. Push me. Does any of that resonate from what you see?
Yeah, because the way we measure productivity actually doesn't really capture what startups do. If you think of productivity, it's production of things at scale is what moves the needle when you think about GDP. But again, that funnel, right? That long funnel where the front end is the innovations that are being driven by the entrepreneurs and the innovators at small scale. So what happens over time is those innovations actually drive more efficiency in the front end. So you think about something like, and I haven't seen this fully captured and discussed, but you think about the ride sharing phenomenon. You think about Uber and Lyft, and you think about how much more use that makes of cars that are already out there. So you actually have greater efficient use of cars, but you have fewer cars that need to be made. And so and you think about Airbnb, it's the same thing. You actually need to make fewer homes and fewer hotels if people are using existing home spaces more efficiently, because the technological rails that we've created allow for lower transaction costs for using those resources. And so when you think about productivity numbers at scale, that doesn't actually capture innovation, because innovation actually does a lot for actually address the efficient use of what we already have, especially the technological information-based information that we have now. I mean, information technology is about using information to use things more efficiently. And so I think the way that people have actually tracked what's productive in society is actually not necessarily the best way to to think about where a lot of the innovation is coming from right now, which is a better, efficient uses of what's already in the system.
Let's go to the inevitable. Okay, we got a boom. Will it last? Are you betting that we'll continue to see business formation rates at heightened levels above where we were in 2016, 2017, 2018?
The answer is going to be a mixed answer. I think the technological shifts are real. So clearly, there's a lot more you can do at home now in places, in geographies, and places that were harder to do it before. These Zoom tools, other virtual tools have just accelerated rapidly in the last couple years. So that clearly is here to stay. And we've been very good. The human race has been really good at adopting new technological tools to be more efficient and productive in our lives. What is less clear is the fact that the system itself hasn't shifted. So if we think of the way we govern a society or an economy, the user experience, the UX of an economy is actually still pretty tough if you look outside the raw technology. I talked about the issues in DC in terms of restrictions on business permits for home-based businesses. But if you look at almost every aspect of our governance systems, they're still stuck in the 20th century. So you look at workforce systems, education systems, economic development systems, government contract systems, business formation systems, permitting, licensing, other regulatory barriers, even the patent system. You look at community colleges, you look at library systems. Most of them, by and large, are still in the 20th century. And we have a lot to do to actually catch it up. And if you look at our leaders and what they talked about, whether in the 2020 election, in the heat of the pandemic, or even today, are they really talking about how are we helping as a society to help the people that are the little guys and gals starting up and trying to adjust and create new things? We actually hardly talk about it. It's kind of a ignored issue that's taken for granted in society. So I think the system, the boom is for real. But whether it withers out and reverts back to the original state of what we had before is really the test of our society. Can we actually rally our troops, our forces, and actually shift things better? That's why I created this organization, Right to Start, so we could actually tackle these issues. We can actually look at entrepreneurship not as another special interest group, but as a broad lens by which we view all aspects of governance and economic development. That is, how can we actually look at the way we shift education systems, or the workforce systems, the economic development systems that actually perpetuate the old economy, the incumbent economy of large entrenched corporations, and actually think about how do we empower the innovators and the people that are creating new value in society.
Victor, I'm going to let you go here in a minute, but just you made me think. Do you have a favorite policy objective or intervention that you think could have the most widespread impact?
The approach we're taking at Right to Start is actually to look at the playing field is unlevel. It's much harder to be small and new than it is to be old and entrenched. And so the things that we love talking about are things that actually tilt the playing field back. So to create a level playing field, you've actually got to tilt it. You've actually got to tilt it in favor of the little guys and gals that are starting something. So we have what we call 5% to start. And 5% to start is saying, look, there are a lot of basic systems of government that actually are institutionalized against entrepreneurs. They actually make it harder for entrepreneurs than for entrenched players. And those would be government contracting systems, workforce systems, and economic development systems. So in government contracts, anyone that's ever tried to go after a government contract who's not someone who's entrenched in the system knows the system is arrayed against you. It's hard to get certified. It's hard to win. It's hard to figure out the bureaucracy to win a new government contract. If you look at workforce systems, the U.S. government spends $13 billion a year now on workforce support. Almost zero of that goes towards people actually using their skills to create new enterprises. Almost all of it goes towards subsidizing skills training for large corporations. That's just one example. And economic development, these stories are well known, where we offer billions of dollars of incentives for large corporations to move between borders of cities and states. Those types of incentives never get offered to little startup companies, but we actually know that's where the jobs come from. In Fort Worth, they just did a study and found that new enterprises, entrepreneurs, created over 5 times the new jobs of companies that were offered incentives to move to Fort Worth. And so we've got essentially an unfairness you look, little startup companies don't do great ribbon cuttings, but if a mayor attracts a new business to Fort Worth, they can do, attracts a large corporation to Fort Worth, they can do a ribbon cutting. But the reality is you get 5 times the money back for new enterprises than you do for giving ribbon cuttings to large corporations with tax subsidies.
Victor, that might be a good way to end it. Victor, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Christopher.
Appreciate it. And we'll make sure to drop links to Right to Start, an organization that we at Technically are certainly following really closely. Really appreciated Victor's work through the years. Victor, it's a pleasure. For those of you, make sure to check out our Introduced conference. And as always, we'll have recaps of all of the conversations taking place there and before. Check out Technically. We'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody. See ya.